It's the Leonard Files podcast, Friday, February 27th, 2026. I'm investigative reporter Eric Leonard from NBC Los Angeles. A number of interesting developments in the last few days having to do with some of the cases that we've been trying to track, the stories we've been covering as intensely as we can, including the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. This is the 14-year-old girl whose remains were found in a Tesla sedan owned by or registered to the pop singer David. There's some court documents that became public inadvertently this week that have shed some new light on the case, so we'll go through that. The LA Fire Department's plans to try to manipulate the media coverage of the Palisades fire after action report, those became public because of a public records request. We'll go through that document, and you can decide whether or not this worked or not. And also piling on to the bad news at City Hall, the former fire chief, Kristen Crowley, has now sued the city of LA, the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, alleging that her firing following the Palisades fire was an exercise in blaming somebody, not for any legitimate reason, and she's made some allegations in court of retaliation. Violations of laws under the state's labor code and constitution. So we'll get to all of that. I wanted to begin, though, with the revelations in the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case. She is the young woman who vanished, the police believe, back in 2024. They say, according to our law enforcement contacts, they suspect she died in the spring of 2025, so perhaps around a year ago, and her remains were found in September when that black Tesla sedan that belonged to the singer David was ticketed, then impounded from a side street in the Hollywood Hills. And when it got to the tow yard, there was an examination of the car that led to the suspicion that there were human remains inside. And that was a story we first broke some months back. The development now, it comes to us in a very unusual way, which is that the case that's being investigated, the potential criminal death of this young woman, is being investigated here in Southern California by the Los Angeles Police Department. And the prosecutor on the case, a deputy district attorney named Beth Silverman, who works out of the Major Crimes Unit, has handled a number of very high-profile murder cases for the DA's office, has been conducting part of that investigation through the use of a grand jury, which is a different but not unusual or uncommon method of fact-gathering. Typically, a police department will send out detectives to investigate a crime. They'll gather what they believe to be enough evidence to prove the crime, present it to prosecutors, and then a decision is made about whether or not to file a criminal charge. On more high-profile and complicated cases, oftentimes the prosecutor and the police are working much more closely together, and in some cases, the investigative action takes place through the use of a grand jury, which is a secretive process. It's all done with a layer of confidentiality beyond what an ordinary police investigation would deliver, and grand jurors can issue demands for testimony and documents. And those people who are brought in to testify, the documents that are brought in, are under this extra veil of secrecy while the case is in progress. Once an indictment is returned, if an indictment is returned, everything the grand jury does becomes public. So when I say secret, it's only temporarily secret, so the investigation can proceed without us and members of the public finding out what's going on, which is pretty important if you are trying to discover information about somebody who you believe have committed a criminal act. You don't want to tip your hand, you being the prosecutor and the police, you don't want to tip your hand about what it is that you know about the investigation. The other thing that a grand jury can do is that it can compel people to come in and talk who otherwise might be unwilling. For example, if the police show up at a potential witness's door and they knock on the door and they flash their badge and they say, "Sir or ma'am, we'd love to ask you some questions about whatever the thing is," that person has every right to decline. Just say, "I don't want to talk." Or they could say, "Let me talk to my lawyer first," and they have a consultation with an attorney, and many times that attorney might counsel their client not to be interviewed by law enforcement. In that case, the grand jury can issue a subpoena for testimony, and for the most part, you have to show up. Doesn't mean there aren't reasons why you may not answer certain questions, But typically, if you get a grand jury subpoena, you are commanded under the threat of law enforcement to go to court and at least appear. You can bring a lawyer, but the lawyer can't be in there with you. You can consult with the lawyer during questioning, but they are not in the room to stop or block or object to anything that the prosecutor does. And it is a one-sided process. It's the prosecution presenting or trying to get information about a particular crime. Anyway, so now that you know that, I can tell you the significance of what happened in this last week, which was in Texas, a long ways away from here, Hempstead, Texas. The family of the singer David, whose legal name is David A. Burke, went to a judge to try to stop the enforcement of grand jury subpoenas that had been issued by the LA Superior Court, directed by Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman, investigating the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And rather than appear in court as commanded, they went to a judge in Texas and asked that judge to stop California from being able to enforce those subpoenas in another state. In any other moment, this would be a real non-issue. States cooperate on things like this all the time, and there is a general presumption that if a court in one state issues a demand to another state, that other state helps in carrying out whatever that court order is. There's exceptions to this, and they can be challenged, and sometimes people have legitimate reasons to challenge a legal order from another state, but a lot of that happens in civil court. It is rare to see it happen in criminal matters, because, again, they're generally honored. There's given the presumption that whatever the court order is legitimate. In this case, the mother and father and brother of David A. Burke, a.k.a. David the pop singer, went to this judge to say, can you block California from compelling us to go out there and testify in front of a grand jury? And because of the way they challenged this, all of the documents and records having to do with the filing they made in court, 2 different hearings that were held before a judge there, were filed in open court. And with it, the lawyers representing the family members of pop singer David filed the grand jury paperwork that was sent to them in order to compel their appearance in front of the LA County grand jury investigating this young woman's death. And because of the decision to file this openly, not under seal, we have a little bit more of a glimpse into where that investigation is going. So let's go to the court file. And this is a copy of one of the court demands issued from Los Angeles County, and this was sent to David A. Burke's father, Dawood Burke. You are commanded to appear before the grand jury of the County of Los Angeles, 11th day of February, 8 o'clock a.m., and it says you can go, and you can't tell anybody except a lawyer that you've hired to represent you. And this is usually pretty much all we know when people are commanded to appear before grand juries. But again, they attached a bunch of other documents here, so let's scroll down a little bit more. This is a form that would typically be filed by an LAPD detective who had been sent to serve one of these grand jury orders. Usually these subpoenas are done in person. This is not something they can mail you. Sometimes local police will have will be asked by the out-of-state agency to go serve this on their behalf. In this case, it looks like an LAPD detective went out to Texas to serve these. There is a filing here from a judge who issued the order certifying to the court out of state. So California, Los Angeles Superior Court judge certifying to a Texas court that this is a legitimate order. The person who signed this was Judge Craig Richmond. He works down in criminal division at LA Superior Court, dated January 15th, and certifies that it's real. Clerk certifies that it's real. Okay, so now we're going to move on to what's called a petition for attendance of an out-of-state witness filed under seal. This is filed under seal in L.A. Again, for all the reasons we were talking about, this is to prevent the target of an investigation from learning the specifics of the investigation before it's reached its maturity or ripeness. In this case, the people of the state of California versus David Burke. Again, that's David the pop singer. And it says the undersigned deputy DA wants to obtain the attendance of a witness from outside of California in this particular criminal case, and certifies. There is pending in the Superior Court of the County of LA, above entitled Grand Jury Investigation, Target David Burke. Now, some months back, let me just pause right there. Some months back, we at NBC4 in LA reported, based on our law enforcement sourcing, that everybody working on this case was considering David Popsinger, David A. Burke, the suspect in some kind of criminal event that led to the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. It's important to point out, the last we heard from the LA County Coroner's Office, which was a few months back when the coroner sealed the case from public view, removed the case from public view and placed it under a law enforcement security seal, said that that was at the request of the Los Angeles Police Department. But at that moment, the coroner had not yet determined how Celeste Rivas Hernandez died, and whether or not that death was an accident, a criminal act, or some other medical event. Our understanding back then was that they were having a hard time figuring that out because, as we'll see in just a moment, when her remains were discovered, they were in a pretty terrible state. So it is very interesting that in this grand jury demand to Texas, so that these witnesses are produced for the grand jury investigation, it is no longer being characterized as an undetermined death. It says, Target David Burke, where Target may be involved in having committed the following criminal offenses against the law of the state of California: 1 count of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187. So this is not exactly breaking news, because it really was clear to all of us who've been following this case that that was the direction this was going in, but it is something else entirely to see it spelled out this way in black and white. The authorities investigating this case have reached the conclusion that they believe she was murdered. It wasn't an accident, and whatever other possibilities were being examined are now appear to be off the table. I'm going to go back to the document, but just be forewarned, there's a pretty grisly description of the discovery. I'm going to include it here because it's in a public court filing. It's relevant to everything we've been reporting on, but if you're squeamish at all, skip ahead. All right, let's go back to the court filing here. On the second page of this grand jury demand, a grand jury investigation is currently pending, and they want Dawood Burke. Again, this is for the father, but there are identical documents here for both David Burke's mother and his brother, Caleb. It is alleged that in this case, the target may be involved in the death of 14-year-old victim Celeste Rivas Hernandez, who may have been a victim of foul play. So it's interesting. A couple of paragraphs up, they say they're investigating a murder, and then here they say may have been the victim of foul play. I'm not sure why the disparity is there. Clearly, this is a murder case. Her severely decomposed, dismembered body was found in the front trunk of Target's Tesla on September 8th, 2025. And you'll remember this was the tow manager, the manager at Hollywood Tow, who had reported that something smelled bad coming from the car. I'll keep reading. September 8th, 2025, 10:30 hours. LAPD received a phone call from the manager of the Hollywood Area Official Police Garage, the OPG. Manager said that there was a strong smell of decay from the vehicle, which was attracting flies. LAPD also noticed the smell. They obtained a search warrant for the vehicle. I think I showed that a few months back. That's the only search warrant that's been published openly in court as a result of this investigation, and it just said human remains were discovered. Upon opening the compartment, detectives observed a black cadaver bag covered with insects and a strong odor of decay. Utilizing black latex gloves, detectives partially unzipped the bag and observed a decomposed head and torso. One interesting note about all of this in our previous reporting is that we had, because nobody was speaking specifics on this, meaning the detectives investigating the case, we had heard conflicting information through our contacts about whether or not there had been an effort at dismemberment. Some people said yes, some people said no. The fact that there was a dismemberment is really significant to the story because it suggests that this couldn't have been entirely accidental. Shouldn't say it suggests, it's conclusive. It could not have been entirely accidental. And it certainly seems to suggest some effort at disposing or concealment of evidence. And that goes with something else that we reported a few months back, which is that the investigators were fairly confident, and we don't know what this is based on, that more than one person was involved in whatever these circumstances are that led to her death and her discovery inside the Tesla. We'll go back to the document. Detectives obtained the search warrant. They partially unzipped the bag, observed decomposed head and torso. Upon removing the cadaver bag from the front storage compartment, it was discovered the arms and legs had been severed. A second black bag was discovered underneath, and the other body parts were discovered in the bag underneath. So this is, pretty awful. One thing that is also notable about the description there is that, again, we had heard from our contact some months back that the container that she was placed in, I believe they're referring to the bag, was a very specific and very unusual one. And now that makes more sense, seeing what's in this court filing, that it was a cadaver bag. I'm guessing that's the same thing as what we would commonly call a body bag. So, in other words, this was not a makeshift container. It was something that was purchased or obtained, and it's a specific thing for doing something with a human body remain. That is really unusual. Outside of funeral homes and the coroner's office, I can't remember hearing about a case that involved a purpose-made body bag or cadaver bag. And so maybe that's an important avenue of investigation for all of the detectives who are working on this. That's essentially the substance of what came out this week. The detail about how she was discovered and the supposition, I think maybe is the best way of saying it, that the case is a murder case, not an accidental death case, although the second paragraph that references what's under investigation sort of backs away from the idea that it's definitely a murder, but it's definitely a criminal matter. It is not known to us whether or not the people who were subpoenaed actually showed up in court to testify. However, and that's because all the grand jury stuff is secret. However, there were 2 hearings in front of the judge in Texas that the family members had asked to block the enforcement of these subpoenas. And at the end of that hearing, the judge refused. The judge said this is a valid demand from California. There was a local deputy district attorney who stood in and acted in order to represent the interests of California at that hearing. And the judge said, I can't stop this. I am serving this order on you, meaning the family members who were there in court, or their lawyers. I don't know if they were there in person. And the judge said, you got to go. You have to go testify. Grand jury subpoenas usually come with a little travel accommodation. The county of Los Angeles pays for the plane ticket out here. You get driven to and from the courthouse. And if you happen to have to stay overnight, they pay for a hotel. So it's not like they're imposing on the person to float their own attendance at the grand jury appearance. If it was somebody locally, I don't think you get that accommodation, although maybe they drive you. I'm not sure. So we'll continue to follow every development we can in that case. Again, because it's a grand jury matter, there's this extra layer of secrecy over everything, so it may be a little bit difficult for us to find out a lot more until this case eventually goes to court and there's a decision made about whether or not there's a crime to prosecute, and if so, then it would become public. Let us turn now to the other big developments in the Palisades fire fallout, maybe is the best way of saying that, from this last week. This has to do with the LA City Fire Department's management of the public release of its after-action report on the Palisades fire, which I feel like we should mention was produced internally and supervised by some of the very administrators who were also involved in the Palisades fire planning and response itself. As is pointed out in one of the documents that we'll look at in a minute, you would hope that the city of Los Angeles would have gone outside the fire department for an analysis of its actions or inactions, the preparation and the response, and it did not. It did it internally. And there is another independent-ish outside review that's been commissioned or requested by the mayor. I'm not sure when that's going to happen, but the after-action report that was prepared, which is required under state law, was released the afternoon the federal government announced the arrest of a man who is now charged federally with federal arson charges, it's 2 federals, for the ignition of the Lackman fire, which was the smaller of the 2 brush fires that burned in the Palisades in January 2025. The ATF says embers from that Lackman fire smoldered underground for a week and then reignited suddenly in the high winds on January 7th, causing the Palisades fire to explode and destroy hundreds, thousands of buildings and homes. So, that afternoon, the LA City Fire Department put out its after-action review, and if you're an astute viewer of news coverage, you'll remember that the interim fire chief, Ronnie Villanueva, was doing news interviews that afternoon. What we didn't know then, but we know now, is that the city of LA, both the City Hall and the LA City Fire Department, had begun a process of trying to manipulate the coverage of that after-action report weeks and months before it came out. There was a private public relations firm called The Lead Company, which typically does entertainment industry celebrity stuff, that had been hired by the fire department through the use of, I think it was $65,000 from the LA Fire Foundation to do public relations work for the city, most of it apparently having to do with trying to control how the news covered the release of this after-action report. And they did some other stuff too. But the interesting part has to do with a planning document that was released to the LA Times in response to one of its public records requests in the last week. We've made a bunch of records requests ourselves, and the city's been dragging its feet in releasing them. We've asked for some of the same material, even though it's been published and given to the LA Times. It hasn't been shared elsewhere. We've asked for some other things. We were told March, even though their requests were made months ago. I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully what we've asked for will expand our understanding of what was going on here. But let's go back to that document from the LA City Fire Department. It is the strategic response plan. Not a response to a fire. This is a plan to control what you learned about the fire and how the fire department behaved during it. And of course, the thing that caught everybody's attention was this second paragraph at the top of all of this, which says, "It's our goal to prepare and protect Mayor Bass, the city, and the LAFD from reputational harm associated with the upcoming public release of the after-action review report through a comprehensive strategy that includes risk assessment, blah, blah, blah." Let me just pause here for a minute. I'll show you a little more of this, but it bears mentioning here. The fire department and the city of Los Angeles are public agencies that are supposed to be doing things in the best interest of the public. Protecting their reputation is not one of those things. Mistakes get made in government decisions all the time. The job of a government agency is to be open with the public about what happened and then do your best to not make the same mistake again. Not to protect the reputation of particular city leaders or city departments. And it's somewhat shocking they'd put that in writing, even if that's the intent. Again, this is on LA City Fire Department letterhead, but our understanding is this is something that was produced with the close assistance, if not entirely, by this private public relations company. You can see the mayor's office is involved in all this. Representatives from the fire department and those 3 people from the public relations firm. Nobody else is listed. And it goes on for a few pages, lays out a timeline for when they're going to release this thing and when they're going to release that thing. This timeline here isn't what actually happened, because the same day the Department of Justice announced the arrest, they let all this out. There were plans to do these private briefings with people. There were statements that were pre-written. There was a plan to go and brief the Board of Fire Commissioners. They're the alleged oversight board that's supposed to help set policy and make sure, acting on behalf of the public, that the fire department's doing its job. There were supposed to be briefings with members of the city council in private, people who worked on the public safety committee. And then there were going to be one-on-one meetings with the mayor, with Tracy Park, council members Monica Rodriguez and Tim McOsker. And then they were going to have private media briefings. This is sort of an embargo situation where they will come to someone like me and say, hey, we want to tell you about this thing that you can report on sometime in the future, but you have to agree not to report on this now so that we can discuss it openly. This is just me talking personally here, like as a mediocre news reporter. Like, I have a problem with these things because inevitably whoever is offering you the embargo situation is trying to co-opt you into presenting its side before anything else. And I generally try to avoid these, which is part of why I don't get invited to the party on stuff like this. But everybody can make their own decision about it. And yeah. So they listed a bunch of news reporters. One thing that we found very interesting about the people who were listed is some of them were labeled as negative. I would hope if I was on the list, I would be labeled negative because it's not my job to be their PR firm. We got to report what's really going on here. And it is not clear to me, however, if this list goes beyond this. We asked the mayor's office and the city fire department to give us their list of news reporters and the associated labels that they've applied to us, whether we are negative or positive or whatever it is. I don't know. And then it goes on to include a bunch of scripts for news releases, for even what people in the fire department were supposed to email in order to invite the different reporters to come in and look at the after-action report. There's another document that I don't have with me where the interim fire chief, Ronnie Villanueva, was given scripted answers to virtually every question they could imagine would be asked by a reporter, with the instructions that no matter what question you get asked, ignore it and just go to the script in order to get your points across. And then the public relations firm writes in there, this way the reporters will be conditioned to frame their story around what you said when you didn't answer their question. This all just goes to this big idea that the city of Los Angeles was spending an extraordinary amount of time and money trying to control what you in the public found out about the Palisades fire. And it seems like we're eventually going to get to a truthier version of all of this with some kind of independent review. We're still told that there's going to be a state review of the Palisades fire that nobody's seen yet. There is still the cause and origin report, or origin and cause report, that was completed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that has a lot of information about the case. That's still under seal. None of us have seen that yet, and that's something that may come out during the criminal case. All of those things put together will give us probably the most honest, accurate reflection of what happened, what went wrong, what should have happened in the Palisades fire. This is sort of a bump in the road on the way there. All right, one last thing before we go. I know I've been yammering for a long time, and this has to do with another issue that has caused some consternation at City Hall, and it has to do with the former LA City Fire Chief, Kristen Crowley, who was the chief at the time of the Palisades fire and was removed from her position some weeks afterwards by LA Mayor Karen Bass. Bass said that Crowley was being removed because she refused to participate in an after-action report and because Crowley failed to do a bunch of things in preparation for the Palisades fire that the mayor says contributed to the poor management. You can read into that, the expanse of the destruction, really. Crowley filed a a claim against the city of Los Angeles some months ago, saying that she was planning to sue the city of LA, that her removal from the fire chief's job was retaliatory, and the city has so many weeks or months to look at that claim, and if the city doesn't respond to it, it's considered rejected, and then you can sue the city of Los Angeles, which is what happened in the last few days. So Kristen Crowley has now sued based on retaliation, both under the Labor Code and under the California Constitution, and she alleges in her lawsuit that she was wrongfully removed because the mayor had to blame somebody. I'm paraphrasing here. The mayor had to blame somebody for the mismanagement of the fire. An instructive paragraph here. When the Palisades fire erupted, Bass, then out of the country, remember she was on a trip to Ghana, initially praised the department's preparedness, even issuing a press release highlighting its deployment strategy. But as criticism mounted over her absence and her decision to cut the operating budget for LAFD, Bass reversed course. She sought to avoid accountability by shifting blame and lying, including falsely claiming that she was not aware of the nationally anticipated weather event, falsely claiming that the LAFD budget was not cut, and falsely claiming that LAFD's resources would have supported an additional 1,000 firefighters to fight the blaze, claims contradicted by public records and Bass's own prior statements. The claims that Crowley is making is that the things that she was accused of failing to do were things that couldn't have happened. And in particular, I'll just take a couple of these. The idea that she should have held the previous day's firefighters on duty past the end of their shift. Firefighters work 24-hour shifts. So on the morning of the fire, one of the things that could have happened was that the fire chief could have ordered that everybody coming off shift at 6 or 7 in the morning remain on duty for the next 24 hours. They can extend your duty. The problem with that, as we've learned from people inside the fire department, and it's been discussed publicly at length, is what are you going to do with those firefighters? Each station has apparatus, engines, and trucks, but there's only so many seats on those. So if you have a firehouse and a full shift staffs all the seats on those engines and trucks, where do you put the duplicate number of them if they're held over from the previous shift? How do you get them to a fire? How do you use those people effectively? And the second issue that Crowley brings up, also disputed by the mayor, is that the city fire department's operational budget, it's important that we use that phrase or that term, the operational budget had been cut even though the dollar budget had gone up. That's a function of the fact that firefighters earn more and more money every year. They get raises, they get bonuses, and so the money that's left over after paying the salaries to do all the other stuff the fire department has to do, that can shrink even when the bottom line dollar budget of the department increases. And Crowley says that's exactly what happened because they, in years past, had to cut mechanics and they had fewer extra fire engines laying around that were ready, they call them ready reserve, that were ready to be used in a major emergency because they didn't have the mechanics that were needed to fix the ones that were sitting in the maintenance yard. The mayor says none of that's true. Crowley said that the decisions that were made, I'm just paraphrasing from her lawsuit, the decisions that were made the morning of the Palisades fire to add additional firefighters was contingent on having some vehicle for those firefighters to use to then be able to go fight a fire if they needed to. And so I think there were about 200 extra people on duty that morning. They were placed all over Southern California, and not all of them were close to the Palisades because nobody could predict where a fire would start. Let me just read to you from the mayor's office statement. The mayor's office said, in response to the lawsuit, there is nothing new here. Ms. Crowley was removed from her post for her failure to pre-deploy and her decision to send 1,000 firefighters home instead of keeping them on duty the morning the fires broke out. This lawsuit has no merit. So, it is on the slow track over in LA civil court. Cases there can take months, if not years, to get to a point where there could be a trial. Obviously, a lot of them settle out beforehand, and we'll keep tabs on that. All right, I'm going to leave it there for this week. Just as we were recording this, there were depositions of LA City firefighters who were at the scene of the smaller brush fire that's blamed for causing the Palisades fire. Those depositions had been under seal. Some of them are now public. It was too much to go through today with all the other fire stuff, so I will try to get to those next week. The top line out of that is that one or more of the firefighters who were out there said the ground was still smoking when they were told to pick up and leave. And that, of course, is the major contention behind the lawsuits brought by thousands of Palisades fire victims who say that the city could have prevented the Palisades fire and didn't. Be sure to click like and subscribe so you don't miss our next one, and I'll see you next time.